How Mossad picked up at 2:17 a.m., picked up by equipment the Soviets had abandoned 3 months earlier when they pulled out of East Berlin in a hurry that looked planned but smelled like panic. The voice was speaking Arabic, Levantine dialect, careful and clipped. The shipment arrives Thursday. Same route, same protocols. Tell Sabri we need confirmation by noon or the window closes. In a basement beneath a bookstore in West Berlin, Yael Arad listened to the transmission through headphones that were older than she was, Soviet-made, heavy and uncomfortable, and thought about how strange it was that the KGB's loss had become Mossad's most valuable asset in the city. The listening post was supposed to be dead, dismantled, a relic of a Cold War that had ended with champagne and sledgehammers and politicians declaring peace. Instead, it had become a spider's web, and Abu Nidal's men were walking straight into it. Wait, before the next operation begins. If this mission already pulled you into the shadows, tell us where you're watching from. To stay inside the next secret, betrayal, or act of justice, subscribe and join the agency. Eyes open. Back to the mission. The operation had started 4 months earlier, not in Berlin, but in Vienna, where a Mossad informant in the Austrian police had flagged something unusual: a series of apartment rentals in the Turkish district, all paid in cash, all by men who gave different names but matched a pattern. Middle Eastern, well-dressed, speaking German with accents that placed them somewhere east of Ankara and west of Baghdad. They kept irregular hours, received no mail, and made phone calls from payphones 3 blocks away instead of from their apartments. Classic surveillance consciousness, the kind you learned in training camps or picked up after years of running operations in hostile territory. Vienna Station had photographed them, run the images through databases in Tel Aviv, and gotten hits on 2 faces: Marwan Kreish, a Palestinian militant with ties to Abu Nidal's organization, and Hassan Kabani, a Lebanese facilitator who'd been linked to the 1985 Rome and Vienna airport attacks that had killed 19 people and wounded 100 more. Abu Nidal's organization, the Fatah Revolutionary Council, was the most extreme of the Palestinian militant groups, notorious for brutality, paranoia, and attacks that killed indiscriminately. They'd hijacked planes, bombed synagogues, assassinated diplomats, and murdered other Palestinians they deemed traitors with a viciousness that even the PLO condemned. Abu Nidal himself was a ghost, moving between Baghdad, Damascus, and Libya, protected by governments that found him useful and feared him equally. His network was cellular, compartmentalized, impossible to penetrate. Mossad had been hunting him for a decade with limited success. Individual operatives eliminated, small cells disrupted, but the organization kept regenerating like a hydra growing new heads. Until now. Because the men in Vienna weren't hiding well enough. They were good, but they'd gotten comfortable, operating in a city they thought was neutral ground. And comfort in intelligence work was the crack that let everything break open. Ronen Zamir ran the operation from Tel Aviv, a career intelligence officer in his late 40s who'd spent 20 years in collections and now oversaw European operations from a windowless office that smelled like coffee and old paper. He'd called Yael into a meeting on a Tuesday afternoon, just the 2 of them, and laid out the situation with the methodical precision of someone who'd briefed 1,000 operations and knew exactly which details mattered. Vienna Station has been running surveillance for 6 weeks, he said, spreading photographs across the table. We've identified a pattern. Kreish and Kabani are logistics coordinators, moving weapons and documents between cells. They're careful, but they're using a relay system. Dead drops, coded phone calls, meetings in public places. Standard tradecraft. Yael studied the photographs. Cafes, train stations, parks. Men who looked like businessmen or students, never the same face twice. Never any physical contact that would indicate a handoff. Where's the vulnerability? She asked. Ronen tapped one photograph. A man standing near a payphone, his back to the camera. Communications. They're using public phones, but they're calling the same numbers repeatedly. We've identified 3 hubs, one in Vienna, one in Rome, one in Berlin. The Berlin number is the most active. 17 calls in the last month, all from different payphones in Vienna, all to the same number in East Berlin. East Berlin? The wall's been down for 2 years. Why East Berlin? That's what we want to know. The number traces to an apartment building in Prenzlauer Berg, a working-class neighborhood. Could be a safe house, could be a communications relay. But here's the interesting part. He pulled out another document, a technical report stamped with security classifications. The building was owned by the Stasi until 1990. After reunification, it was sold to a private company, apartments rented to civilians. But the basement was never converted. It's still listed as technical infrastructure, which usually means communications equipment, Yael finished. The Stasi left hardware behind. Exactly. And before the Stasi, it was KGB. The building sits on a major telecommunications junction point. Cables from all over East Berlin ran through that basement. The Soviets used it as a listening post during the Cold War, intercepting phone calls, radio transmissions, everything. When the Stasi took over, they inherited the equipment and kept using it. Yael leaned back, thinking. And when the wall fell, everyone assumed it was dismantled.
Assumed. But what if it wasn't? What if someone left the equipment in place, either through bureaucratic incompetence or because they thought it might still be useful someday? And what if Abu Nidal's men found it? Ronan smiled, the tight smile of someone who just confirmed his own suspicions. That's the question. We sent a technical team to Berlin 2 weeks ago, posing as telephone engineers doing maintenance. They got into the basement. Yael, the equipment is still there. Not all of it, but enough. Receivers, transmitters, cable access to the junction point. It's old, Soviet-era hardware, but it works, and someone's been using it recently. We found evidence of power consumption, fresh wiring, new equipment integrated with the old. Abu Nidal's network is using a KGB listening post to coordinate operations. That's what we think. The irony is beautiful, isn't it? The Soviets built it to spy on the West, and now Palestinian militants are using it to plan attacks against Israel and anyone else they consider an enemy. Yael studied the photographs again, seeing them differently now. Not just men making phone calls, but pieces of a network that stretched across Europe, coordinated through technology that was supposed to be dead. So we shut it down, she said. Find whoever's running it, arrest them or eliminate them, disrupt the network. No, Ronan said quietly. We do something better. We turn it into a trap. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its complexity. Instead of shutting down the Berlin listening post, Mossad would take control of it. They'd infiltrate the building, access the equipment, and use it to monitor Abu Nidal's communications. Every call, every transmission, every piece of coordination running through that basement would flow through Mossad's hands first. But more than that, they'd use it to feed false information back into the network.
Manipulate the communications, create phantom operations, lure Abu Nidal's operatives into situations where they could be identified, tracked, and eliminated. Turn the listening post into a weapon pointed at the people who thought they controlled it. It was the kind of operation that looked brilliant on paper and could collapse catastrophically in practice. Too many variables, too many points of failure. If Abu Nidal's men discovered the compromise, they'd scatter, change all their protocols, and Mossad would lose the window into the network. If the operation leaked to German intelligence, which it would have to eventually, because running active intelligence operations on German soil without cooperation was illegal and politically explosive, the bureaucracy could kill it before it yielded results. But if it worked... Well, needs someone in Berlin, Ronan had said, full-time, embedded, someone who can manage the technical side, coordinate with the surveillance teams, and make real-time decisions when the situation changes. It's going to be months of work, Yael. Long hours, high stress, living in a safe house with equipment that might fail at any moment. Are you interested? Yael had been with Mossad for 8 years, trained in signals intelligence, fluent in German and Arabic, and hungry for an operation that mattered. She'd spent the last 2 years analyzing intercepts in Tel Aviv, building reports that other people used to plan operations she never saw. She was good at it, meticulous and patient, but she joined intelligence to be in the field, not behind a desk. "When do I leave?" she'd asked. Ronan had smiled. 3 days. We're calling it Operation Resonance. Welcome to Berlin. The safe house was a bookstore. Actually, it was an apartment above a bookstore in Kreuzberg, a neighborhood in West Berlin that had been bohemian before the wall fell and was now trying to figure out what it was in a unified Germany.
The bookstore sold used books in 4 languages: German, English, French, Russian, and was owned by a man named Otto Brenner, who'd been working with Israeli intelligence since 1973, when Mossad had helped him relocate from East Germany after the Stasi discovered his brother was smuggling dissidents to the West. Otto was 68, spoke 7 languages, and asked no questions about the equipment Yael had moved into the basement. He just unlocked the door, showed her where the electrical panel was, and went back to selling books about philosophy and poetry to students who couldn't afford them but bought them anyway. The basement had been a storage room for decades, boxes of unsold books, old furniture, dust thick enough to write in. Yael and a technical team spent 3 days converting it into an operations center. Computers, receivers, monitors, secure communications equipment that could bounce encrypted transmissions to Tel Aviv through satellites that didn't officially exist. They ran cables through the walls, installed ventilation to handle the heat from the electronics, and set up a cot in the corner because Yael would be spending most of her time down here. The equipment from the Berlin listening post, the one Abu Nidal's men were using, was accessed remotely. Mossad's technical team had physically infiltrated the Prenzlauer Berg basement 2 weeks earlier, posing as city workers doing telecommunications infrastructure upgrades. They'd installed taps on the existing Soviet equipment, allowing them to monitor everything that went through it without alerting whoever was using it. The taps fed data to the safe house in Kreuzberg, where Yael would analyze it, identify patterns, and coordinate with field teams tracking Abu Nidal's operatives across Berlin and beyond. It was ingenious, it was fragile, and it depended entirely on the people running the listening post not realizing they'd been compromised. The first transmission Yael intercepted came on her 3rd night in Berlin. She was alone in the basement, surrounded by monitors glowing in the darkness, drinking coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago, when one of the receivers crackled to life. Arabic. A man's voice, speaking quickly, background noise suggesting he was calling from a public place. Package confirmed. Route 7, Wednesday morning, 0600 hours. Tel Aviv relay standing by. Then silence. Yael rewound the recording, played it again, transcribed every word. Package, Route 7, Tel Aviv relay. The terminology was vague, deliberately so, but the implications were clear. Something was being moved, coordinated through multiple locations, with Tel Aviv mentioned specifically. An attack? A weapons transfer? Intelligence gathering? She encrypted the recording, transmitted it to Tel Aviv, and added her analysis. First intercept, likely logistics coordination. Request surveillance on all known Abu Nidal operatives in Berlin vicinity. Will continue monitoring. The response came 30 minutes later. Ronan's voice synthesized through the encryption. Received. Surveillance activated. Good work. Stay alert. Yael sat in the basement, listening to static and the hum of electronics, and felt the operation shift from theoretical to real. Somewhere in Berlin, men were planning something, and now she was listening. The intercepts came irregularly over the following weeks, sometimes 3 in one night, sometimes nothing for 5 days. Yael learned to recognize voices, 7 distinct speakers, all male, all using code names that referenced animals or colors. Red spoke with authority, likely a coordinator. Falcon was cautious, always checking details. Wolf was impatient, pushing for faster timelines. She built profiles, cross-referenced with surveillance reports from field teams tracking known operatives. Faces matched voices. Names, real or operational, emerged.
The network was bigger than Vienna Station had estimated. At least 15 operatives in Berlin alone, moving weapons, documents, and personnel through routes that crisscrossed the city like veins in a body. And all of it was being coordinated through the listening post in Prenzlauer Berg, through equipment the KGB had built to spy on NATO and the Stasi had used to crush dissent. The historical irony wasn't lost on Yael. Intelligence infrastructure was like that, built for one purpose, repurposed for another, outliving the governments that had created it. The breakthrough came 6 weeks into the operation, a transmission at 3:22 a.m., longer than usual, detailed enough to make Yael sit forward and start recording with her hand shaking slightly. Confirmation from Damascus. The Vienna package is approved for deployment. Timeline is flexible, but target date is the 23rd. Berlin team provides transit support. Rhone team handles final positioning. Sabri coordinates with the Czech contact for documents. Another voice, one she hadn't heard before, younger, nervous. What about security? The Austrians increased police presence after the synagogue incident. Red, cold. That's why we're not using Vienna. The target is in Rome, St. Peter's Square, during the Easter Mass. Maximum visibility, maximum impact. Silence on the line. Then the younger voice, quieter. There will be civilians. There are always civilians. That's the point. Do you have a problem with the mission? No, I wanted to confirm the parameters. The parameters are clear. Rome team executes, Berlin provides support. Vienna handles extraction if needed. Any other questions? No. Good. The next transmission will be in 72 hours. Use the secondary protocol. The line went dead. Yael sat frozen, the recording still running, capturing nothing but static.
Then she moved, fingers flying across the keyboard, encrypting the file, transmitting to Tel Aviv with a priority flag that would wake up every analyst on duty. St. Peter's Square, Easter Mass, a bombing, almost certainly, designed for maximum casualties and global attention. Abu Nidal's signature, spectacular violence meant to dominate headlines and prove that nowhere was safe. The response from Tel Aviv came within minutes, not Ronan's synthesized voice, but a direct encrypted call, his actual voice, tight with controlled urgency. Yael, how confident are you in this intercept? 100%, clear audio, multiple speakers, specific target and timeline. They're planning an attack in Rome, St. Peter's Square, Easter Mass. That's 3 weeks away. We have time, but not much. I'm contacting Italian intelligence now, and I'm sending Avi to Berlin to coordinate field operations. Your job is to keep monitoring, see if they transmit any more details, bomb construction, personnel assignments, anything that helps us identify who's executing the attack. Understood. Ronan, they mentioned check documents. Could be passports, travel papers, if we can identify the forger. We're already on it. Focus on the intercepts. This is exactly what we hoped for, Yael. They're using the listening post because they think it's secure, and that makes them careless. Keep listening. The call ended. Yael sat in the basement, surrounded by Soviet equipment and Israeli monitoring systems, listening to static from a KGB listening post that had become a window into a terrorist network planning mass murder. The trap was working. Avi Levin arrived in Berlin 2 days later, a field operative in his mid-30s with 15 years of experience running operations in Europe and the Middle East. He was compact, precise, spoke German without an accent, and had the kind of face that you forgot 5 minutes after meeting him. Perfect for surveillance work.
He met Yael in the bookstore's basement, studied the equipment setup, listened to the intercepts, and nodded with the calm assessment of someone who'd seen operations succeed and fail, and knew the difference usually came down to details nobody thought about until it was too late. "How many operatives do we have eyes on?" he asked. 11 in Berlin, confirmed, Yael said. Another 6 possibles. Vienna station is tracking 8 in Austria. Rome has flagged 5. But the network is cellular. They don't all know each other, and they're using cutouts for communication. Which means if we move on one, the others scatter. Exactly. That's why we haven't made any arrests. We're watching, logging, building the map. The Rome attack is the priority, but Ronan wants the entire network if we can get it. Avi studied the network map on one of the monitors. Nodes and connections, faces and names. A web spreading across 3 countries. The listening post is the center. Everything flows through it. If we can maintain access until after the Rome operation, we can potentially roll up the entire network in a coordinated strike. If they don't discover we're listening. That's always the risk, but they've been using it for months without suspecting compromise. As long as we don't give them a reason to check, they'll keep trusting it. Over the following week, Avi coordinated surveillance teams across Berlin. They photographed meeting sites, logged travel patterns, identified safe houses. They tracked a shipment of electronic components from a supplier in Wedding to an apartment in Neukölln, components that could be used for building detonators. They identified the Czech forger, a man in his 60s who ran a print shop near Alexanderplatz and had been producing false documents for criminals and intelligence services for 3 decades. Each piece of information was logged, encrypted, transmitted to Tel Aviv, where analysts built a comprehensive picture of the operation.
The Rome attack was real. Abu Nidal's network was committed, and Mossad. The Rome attack was real. Abu Nidal's network was committed, and Mossad was watching every step. But then, the operation shifted. The transmission came on a Tuesday night, 11 days before Easter. Yael was monitoring alone, Avi out coordinating with a German BND officer who'd been read into the operation, carefully, with limited details, just enough cooperation to avoid diplomatic catastrophe if things went wrong. Red's voice, but different now, tense, urgent. Abort Rome, repeat, abort Rome, new orders from Damascus. All resources redirect to Berlin target. Confirmation required within 6 hours. Silence. Then another voice, Falcon. Berlin target wasn't scheduled for another 2 months. Why the change?
Damascus says the timeline accelerated. Opportunity window is closing. Rome is secondary now. Berlin is priority. What's the target? You'll receive details on the next transmission. Prepare your team for immediate deployment. This is not negotiable. The line went dead. Yael stared at the monitors, her mind racing. Rome aborted. Berlin now the priority. Damascus, meaning Abu Nidal himself or someone in his inner circle, had changed the plan. But why? And what was the Berlin target? She encrypted the recording, sent it to Tel Aviv with a flash priority, and then did something she wasn't supposed to do without authorization. She accessed the KGB equipment directly. The taps they'd installed allowed passive monitoring, listening to what went through the system without interacting with it. But the equipment could do more. It could trace connections, identify other nodes in the network, potentially access stored data if anyone was using the listening post's infrastructure for more than real-time communications. It was risky. Any unusual activity on the system could alert whoever was operating it, but they needed to know what the Berlin target was, and waiting for the next transmission might be too late.
Yael's fingers moved across the keyboard, accessing systems she'd only practiced on in training. The Soviet equipment was old but well-designed, built when the KGB had unlimited budgets and the Cold War was the only thing that mattered. She navigated through layers of infrastructure, finding where the Prenzlauer Berg listening post connected to Berlin's telecommunications grid. And there, buried in cached data, she found it. A file. Small, text-based, created 2 days earlier. It contained coordinates, a date, a time, and a single word. Synagogue. Yael's breath caught. Not just any synagogue. The coordinates matched the new synagogue on Oranienburger Strasse, one of the most prominent Jewish landmarks in Berlin, recently restored after decades of damage from Nazi persecution and Allied bombing. It was a symbol of Jewish resilience, visited by thousands, protected but not heavily secured because Berlin was supposed to be safe now, unified, past all that. The date was Friday, 4 days away. She pulled back from the system, covered her tracks as best she could, and immediately transmitted to Tel Aviv. Rome abort confirmed, new target, new synagogue, Berlin. Date, this Friday. Recommend immediate intervention. The response came within seconds, Ronan's voice, no longer calm. Get Avi, secure the safe house. We're escalating. The operation shifted into a different gear. What had been patient surveillance became active interdiction. Avi called in a tactical team from Tel Aviv, 4 operatives who arrived in Berlin under commercial cover and set up in a safe house in Charlottenburg. German intelligence was briefed, no longer just the BND officer but senior officials who needed to authorize what was coming next, because Mossad couldn't stop a terrorist attack on German soil without German cooperation. And the Germans, still sensitive about Jewish sites after their history, wanted the threat eliminated with absolute certainty.
The plan was to let the operation develop far enough to identify everyone involved, then execute simultaneous arrests across Berlin, Vienna, and Rome. Capture the operatives, seize the weapons, dismantle the network before it could regenerate. But they needed more information. Who was building the bomb? Where was it being stored? How many operatives were involved in the actual attack versus the support network? Yael listened for 2 days straight, sleeping in 90-minute shifts, surviving on coffee and the adrenaline of knowing that every intercept could be the one that provided the critical detail. The transmissions increased in frequency, Red coordinating with multiple cells, Falcon arranging transportation, Wolf preparing equipment. And then, Thursday morning, 18 hours before the scheduled attack, the transmission that changed everything. Red's voice. Final confirmation. Synagogue target, Friday, 1400 hours. Devices ready. Positioned in the delivery van. Jamal drives, Youssef provides security. Extraction team stands by at the Friedrichstrasse station. Questions? Wolf. What about police presence? Friday afternoon there will be crowds. Red. Cold. That's the point. Maximum casualties. This is about sending a message. Youssef, a voice Yael hadn't heard before, younger. And if we're stopped before we reach the target? You activate remotely. The device is on a timer, but it can be triggered manually. Either way, it detonates. Understood? Understood. Good. Damascus expects confirmation by 1500 hours tomorrow. Do not disappoint. The line went dead. Yale had the recording transmitted to Tel Aviv before the static faded. Within an hour, the tactical plan was approved. German police, coordinating with Mossad, would execute simultaneous raids across Berlin at dawn, 6 hours before the scheduled attack, arrest the operatives, seize the bomb, shut down the network before they could respond.
It was clean, coordinated, and depended entirely on Abu Nidal's men not suspecting they'd been compromised. Avi coordinated with the German tactical units, providing addresses, photographs, known weapons. The listening post in Prenzlauer Berg would be raided simultaneously. Mossad wanted the equipment, the records, anyone who'd been operating it. Yael would remain in the safe house, monitoring communications in case anyone tried to warn the network. She was essential to the operation, but wouldn't be at the arrest sites. It was safer that way, and it meant she'd be listening if something went wrong. At 4:47 a.m., the raids began. Yael listened to it unfold through police radio frequencies, German voices clipped and professional, executing a coordinated operation across the city. Addresses hit simultaneously: an apartment in Neukölln, a warehouse in Wedding, a rented room above a kebab shop in Kreuzberg, and the building in Prenzlauer Berg. The reports came in quickly. Neukölln, 2 suspects in custody, no resistance. Wedding, bomb-making material seized, 1 suspect arrested, 1 fled through a back window but was apprehended 3 blocks away. Kreuzberg, empty, recently vacated, evidence of hasty departure. And then Prenzlauer Berg. The tactical team had entered the building, descended to the basement, and found it empty. Not just empty of people, empty of equipment. The Soviet-era listening post, the receivers and transmitters and cable access that Mossad had been monitoring for 2 months, was gone. Removed recently, within the last 24 hours, leaving only mounting brackets on the walls and loose cables dangling like severed nerves. Someone had known. Yael felt her chest tighten. She pulled up the monitoring locks, checked the taps they'd installed, and found them still functional, still receiving data. But the data was different now. Background noise, automated systems, nothing operational. The listening post had been dismantled, but carefully, leaving the Mossad taps in place to make it look like everything was still functioning. They'd been played. She grabbed the secure phone, called Avi. "The Prenzlauer Berg site is empty. They pulled the equipment." Avi's voice was tight. "When?" "Within the last day, maybe less. They left our taps intact so we wouldn't notice immediately." Which means they knew we were listening. Or suspected enough to relocate. Avi, if they moved to the listening post, they could have moved the attack too. Different location, different timeline. Everything we just raided could be a diversion. Silence on the line. Then, get me everything from the last 48 hours. Every intercept, every transmission. If they changed the plan, there'll be a signal. Yael pulled up the logs, scanning through hours of recordings, looking for anything that stood out. The transmissions had been frequent, detailed, exactly what you'd expect from an operation in its final stages. Too detailed. She'd been so focused on gathering intelligence that she hadn't questioned whether the intelligence was real. But now, looking at it with suspicion instead of confidence, she saw the patterns. The transmissions had been too clean, too specific, providing exactly the kind of information that would make Mossad commit to the raid. They'd been fed false intelligence through their own listening operation. The question was, how much of it was false? Was there really a bomb? Was the synagogue really the target? Or had Abu Nidal's network identified the compromise weeks ago and spent the entire time feeding Mossad a story designed to waste resources and expose Israeli operations in Germany? She went back through the recordings, listening with fresh ears, and found it. A single transmission, 3 days earlier, so brief she'd almost missed it the first time. A voice she didn't recognize, speaking in Arabic, just 7 words. "The Germans are listening." Adjust for the audience. It hadn't been directed at anyone. It wasn't part of a conversation. It was just a statement, transmitted once and never repeated. A warning, or an instruction. Yael transmitted the recording to Tel Aviv, added her analysis. Possible compromise detected 3 days ago. All subsequent transmissions may be deception. Recommend we treat all intelligence from the listening post as potentially false. Ronan's response came immediately. "Stand by. Do not transmit further until we assess the situation." But Yael couldn't stand by, because if the synagogue attack was a diversion, the real attack was happening somewhere else, and they had less than 9 hours to figure out where. She started with what she knew was real, the arrests. The raids had captured 5 operatives, seized bomb-making materials, and found evidence of planning.
That wasn't fake. The materials were real, the operatives were real, which meant some kind of attack had been planned. But was it the synagogue or something else? She pulled up surveillance logs from the field teams, looking for activity that didn't match the intercepts. And there, buried in a report from 2 weeks ago, she found it. A sighting of Marwan Kreisch, the Vienna operative, in Berlin near the Reichstag building. He'd been photographed entering a maintenance facility, staying for 17 minutes, and leaving with a different jacket. The surveillance team had noted it, but hadn't flagged it as significant because the intercepts hadn't mentioned the Reichstag. But now, with the possibility that the intercepts were deception, every unexplained sighting mattered. Yael cross-referenced with German security schedules and found that Friday, today, the Reichstag was hosting a special session.
German Parliament, international observers, security officials from across Europe discussing cooperation and reunification. A much more valuable target than a synagogue, especially for Abu Nidal's organization, which cared more about political disruption than specifically targeting Jews. She called Avi. "I think the real target is the Reichstag. We have a sighting of Kreisch there 2 weeks ago, and there's a major political event today." Avi was silent for a moment. "That's thin, Yael. A single sighting versus detailed intercepts about the synagogue. The intercepts are compromised. They knew we were listening. They fed us what we wanted to hear. But they couldn't fake everything. Kreisch was at the Reichstag. That's real surveillance, not transmitted intelligence. If you're wrong and we pull resources from the synagogue to the Reichstag and the attack happens at the synagogue, then we fail. But if I'm right and we ignore the Reichstag because we're committed to compromised intelligence, we fail worse. Abu Nidal doesn't just kill Jews. He kills politicians, diplomats, anyone who serves the narrative. The Reichstag is the bigger target." Another pause. Then, ill-inform the Germans. They'll have to make the call. 20 minutes later, the decision came down. Split resources. Maintain security at the synagogue while increasing security at the Reichstag. German police would handle both sites, and Mossad's tactical team would support where needed. It was a compromise born of uncertainty, the kind of decision that commanders hated because it meant you weren't fully committed to either option, which meant if either attack succeeded, you'd be blamed for not focusing resources. But it was the best they could do with imperfect intelligence and no time for verification. At noon, 6 hours into the operation, Yael was still in the basement, monitoring every frequency, listening for any transmission that might confirm the target.
The arrested operatives weren't talking, trained, disciplined, or too frightened of Abu Nidal to cooperate. The bomb materials seized in Wedding were real but incomplete, suggesting either poor intelligence about their readiness or that other materials were stored elsewhere. And the listening post remained silent. Whoever had been using it was gone, either arrested or fled, or waiting somewhere with plans they'd never transmitted through channels Mossad could hear. At 1:15 p.m., 45 minutes before the original attack timeline, Avi called. "We found something. The van mentioned in the intercepts, the one supposedly carrying the bomb. German police located it abandoned in a parking garage near Tempelhof. It's empty. No bomb, no equipment, just an empty van." So the synagogue attack was definitely a diversion. It looks that way, but we still don't know where the real attack is. The Reichstag security is at maximum. They've swept the building twice, nothing found. If there's a bomb there, it's not inside the building. Yael thought. Not inside the building. Outside? Nearby? Somewhere with a clear line to the Reichstag but not within the security perimeter? She pulled up a map of the area surrounding the Reichstag, looking at adjacent buildings, sight lines, locations where an explosive device could be positioned to cause damage or casualties. And then she saw it. A construction site, 300 meters from the Reichstag, where a new commercial building was being erected. The site had been active for months, surrounded by fencing and equipment, with materials delivered regularly and workers coming and going on predictable schedules. Perfect for hiding something in plain sight. She called Avi. "Check the construction site northwest of the Reichstag. If I were placing a bomb, I'd hide it there. Materials, vehicles, everything looks normal until it's not." Avi didn't question her, sending a team now. 15 minutes later, his voice came back, tight and controlled. "We found it. Construction trailer, disguised as electrical equipment. Professional setup. Estimated 50 kilograms of explosives. Cell phone detonator. Bomb squad is on site." Yael exhaled, feeling the tension in her chest release slightly. "Can they disarm it?" "They're working on it, but Yael, The detonator is live. Someone could trigger it remotely at any moment. Which meant whoever was supposed to execute the attack was nearby, watching, waiting for the right moment to send the signal that would turn 50 kilograms of explosives into shrapnel and fire and death. Field teams are searching the area, Javi continued. We're looking for anyone with line of sight to the construction site, anyone with a phone who's watching instead of moving. The search would be complicated. This was Berlin on a Friday afternoon, thousands of people moving through the city, dozens with phones, any of whom could be the triggerman. But then Yael remembered something. The intercepts, even if they were deception, had mentioned extraction at Friedrichstrasse station. Not because the attack was at the synagogue, but because that's where the operatives would flee after triggering the bomb at the Reichstag. Check Friedrichstrasse station, she said. The extraction reference was real, they just didn't tell us what they were extracting from. Javi relayed the information to the field teams. 5 minutes later, surveillance spotted him, a man in his 30s, Middle Eastern features, standing on a platform overlooking the construction site, phone in hand, watching the bomb squad work. German police moved in quietly, converging from 3 directions. The man saw them at the last second, reached for his phone, and was tackled before he could press the button. The device in the construction trailer was disarmed 18 minutes later. 0 casualties, 0 detonation. The attack prevented.
The operation wasn't over. With the bomb defused and the triggerman in custody, the focus shifted to rolling up the rest of the network. Interrogations of the arrested operatives, combined with intelligence from the listening post before it was compromised, led to arrests across Europe over the following weeks. Vienna, Rome, Paris, Athens. Cells dismantled, weapons seized, documents captured. Abu Nidal's network in Europe was crippled, though not destroyed. The organization was too decentralized, too paranoid, too willing to sacrifice pieces to save the whole. But the damage was significant, operations disrupted, and the psychological impact of having a major attack prevented was valuable both for intelligence credibility and public safety. Yael's role in the operation was classified, known only to the people directly involved, and buried in reports that would remain secret for decades. She'd spent 2 months in a basement listening to transmissions, building maps, and ultimately trusting her instinct when the intelligence turned false. That instinct had saved lives. Ronan called her 3 days after the operation closed, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent 72 hours managing a crisis and was only now allowing himself to feel it. "You did exceptional work," he said. "The listening post operation, the intercept analysis, identifying the deception, finding the real target, all of it. You saved that parliament session, Yael. Probably saved hundreds of lives." "We got lucky," she said. "If Kreisch hadn't been photographed at the Reichstag, we wouldn't have known. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. You prepared. You built the operation, maintained the surveillance, and when the intelligence turned suspect, you didn't just accept it. You questioned it. That's what separates good intelligence officers from great ones." "What happens to the listening post?" she asked.
The equipment in Prenzlauer Berg. Do we know where they moved it? Gone. Either destroyed or relocated somewhere we haven't found yet. But the lesson is clear. Never trust a single source, even your own systems. Abu Nidal's men figured out they were compromised and turned it against us. It almost worked. How did they know? We were careful with the taps. The monitoring was passive. We're still investigating. Could have been a leak, could have been technical detection we didn't account for, could have been simple operational security on their part. Sometimes networks run checks just to be safe, and they found something that made them suspicious. We may never know exactly when or how. Yael thought about that. 2 months of work, hundreds of hours listening, building trust in a system that had been compromised for an unknown period. It should have felt like failure, but it didn't, because they'd adapted, questioned their own intelligence, and prevented the attack anyway. That was the work. Imperfect information, incomplete pictures, decisions made with uncertainty and consequences that lasted years. "There's something else," Ronan said. "The man we arrested, the trigger man at Friedrichstrasse, he's talking. Not much, but enough. He confirmed that the listening post was discovered about 3 weeks into your operation. They didn't shut it down immediately because they realized they could use it to feed us false intelligence. Everything after that point was theater designed to waste our resources and expose our capabilities. But they still planned a real attack. Of course. The deception was to misdirect us, not to cancel their operation. They wanted us looking at the synagogue while they hit the Reichstag. It was sophisticated, Yael. More sophisticated than we usually give Abu Nidal credit for. Who trained them? That level of counterintelligence? That's not something you learn in a training camp. We think KGB.
Ironic, isn't it? They used Soviet equipment to run their communications, and they may have used Soviet training to identify our surveillance. The Cold War ended, but the infrastructure and expertise are still out there, available to whoever can pay or convince or threaten the right people. Yael sat with that information, thinking about how intelligence operations layered on top of each other, each generation's tools becoming the next generation's weapons, used in ways nobody had anticipated when they were built. "When do I come home?" she asked. "Soon. We're keeping the safe house operational for another month, just in case something surfaces from the arrests. But your active role is done. Good work, Yael. Truly." She stayed in Berlin for 6 more weeks, monitoring communications that grew quieter each day as the network realized it had been compromised and went dark. The bookstore above her safe house continued selling philosophy and poetry to students, Otto Brenner asking no questions and providing coffee when she emerged from the basement looking like she'd forgotten what daylight was. The city changed around her. Berlin was still figuring out what it meant to be unified, still tearing down walls and rebuilding infrastructure, and trying to reconcile 2 histories that had lived separated for half a century. She walked through neighborhoods that had been East Berlin, seeing Soviet-era buildings and streets with German names, layers of occupation and resistance and survival built into the architecture. She thought about the listening post in Prenzlauer Berg, built by the KGB to spy on the West, inherited by the Stasi to control the East, abandoned when the wall fell, and then repurposed by a Palestinian terrorist network to plan attacks across Europe. Intelligence infrastructure was like that, built for one war, used in the next, outliving the ideologies that had justified its creation. And the people who operated it, they were just trying to survive, or seeking revenge, or fighting for causes they believed in, or following orders because that's what duty meant. Sometimes Yael wondered if there was a meaningful difference between those motivations, or if they all led to the same place, basements full of equipment, voices transmitted through frequencies that didn't officially exist, and decisions that killed people who'd never know why. Years later, long after the operation had been declassified in internal reports but remained secret to the public, Yael returned to Berlin. She was older now, running European operations from an office in Tel Aviv, sending others into the field instead of going herself. She walked past the building in Prenzlauer Berg, now converted into expensive apartments, the basement renovated into a parking garage with no trace of the Soviet equipment that had once filled it. The building looked ordinary, like 1,000 others in the city, and nobody passing by would know it had been the center of an intelligence operation that had prevented a bombing and dismantled a terrorist network. She walked to the new synagogue on Oranienburger Straße, the building that had been the decoy target, and stood outside looking at its golden dome catching the afternoon light. Tourists took photographs, couples walked past holding hands, children played in the plaza. None of them knew how close this building had come to being the site of a massacre designed to terrorize a city and dominate headlines around the world. That was the strange nature of prevented tragedies. They left no scars, no memorials, no public memory, just secret reports and classified files, and the quiet knowledge carried by the people who'd stopped them. Yael thought about the listening post, the transmissions she'd monitored for 2 months, the voices of men planning violence with casual precision. She thought about the moment she'd realized the intelligence was false and had trusted her instinct over the data. And she thought about the bomb in the construction trailer. 50 kilograms of explosives that would have killed dozens or hundreds, stopped only because a field team had found it 18 minutes before someone pressed a button. Intelligence work was like that. Hours of patience, fragments of information, decisions made with incomplete data, and outcomes measured in disasters that didn't happen rather than victories you could celebrate. She stood outside the synagogue for a long time, watching people live normal lives in a city that had survived so much: Nazis, Soviets, division, reunification, and threats that most people never knew existed. And then she walked away, back into the city, another face in the crowd, carrying secrets that would outlive her, and answers to questions nobody would ask
because they didn't know the questions existed. That was the work. Silent, invisible, unglamorous, but necessary. Always necessary. The KGB listening post in Prenzlauer Berg was never found. Either it had been destroyed when Abu Nidal's network discovered the compromise, or it had been relocated and was still operating somewhere, used by someone else for purposes Mossad would discover only when the next crisis emerged. Intelligence infrastructure was like that. It didn't disappear. It just changed hands, changed purposes, changed masters, while the equipment kept running. Somewhere in Berlin, or Vienna, or Rome, or a city nobody was watching yet, another listening post was probably operating right now. Built by one intelligence service, discovered by another, repurposed by a third. And somewhere, an officer like Yael was sitting in a basement, wearing headphones that were older than she was, listening to transmissions in languages she'd spent years learning, building maps of networks she'd never fully understand.
Trying to prevent the next attack, stop the next bomb, save the next lives. Knowing that success would be measured in silence. No explosions, no casualties, no headlines. Just the quiet hum of equipment, the static of frequencies, and the voices of people planning violence, unaware they were being heard. That was intelligence work. That was duty. That was the trap. And it kept catching people, operation after operation, year after year. Because the work never stopped, and the threats never ended. And somewhere, always, someone was listening.